It is often said that a philosopher's life is a map of the ideas that later shape his work, and in the case of Ludwig Wittgenstein, the contours of that map are as striking as the terrain they trace. He was born on the 26th of April, 1889, into a family that straddled the worlds of industry and culture. His father, Karl Wittgenstein, was one of the richest men in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a steel magnate whose patronage of the arts placed the young Ludwig in the orbit of composers, painters, and scholars from an early age. The household was a place where the piano's ivory keys rang alongside discussions of philosophy, and it was perhaps this early exposure to both the aesthetic and the analytical that seeded his later preoccupation with the limits of language. Yet, despite the comfortable surroundings, Wittgenstein's childhood was marked by a restless intensity. He was a solitary boy, more inclined to spend hours in the library than on the playground, and even then he seemed to be searching for a language that could capture something beyond the ordinary chatter of his peers. When he entered the Technical University in Berlin in 1908, his path seemed to veer toward engineering, a discipline that promised concrete structures and precise calculations. But the intellectual climate of early 20th century Vienna, then a crucible of modernist thought, was already pulling at his imagination. Vienna was a city where the old empire's decay was juxtaposed with a burgeoning avant-garde. The music of Mahler and Schoenberg, the paintings of Klimt, the psychoanalytic theories of Freud, and the rigorous logical investigations of the newly emerging analytic tradition. In cafes along the Ringstrasse, philosophers and scientists gathered to debate the nature of truth, the structure of reality, and the possibility of a perfect language. Wittgenstein, though still a student of engineering, found himself drawn into these conversations, and it was in this milieu that he first encountered the work of Gottlob Frege. Frege's Begriffsschrift, with its revolutionary treatment of functions, arguments, and the notion of a sense, Sinn, distinct from reference, Bedeutung, offered a new way to think about the logical form of language. In a letter to Frege dated 1913, Wittgenstein wrote, "Your work has opened for me a whole new world of logical analysis." That moment of intellectual awakening was a turning point. Frege's insistence that the meaning of a proposition could be understood in terms of its truth conditions, and that the logical structure of language mirrors the structure of reality, resonated with Wittgenstein's own yearning for precision. Yet Frege alone could not satisfy his hunger. The next influence that would shape his early thought arrived in the form of Bertrand Russell, whose own work on logical atomism and the theory of descriptions had already begun to transform Anglo-American philosophy. Russell's 1905 paper, On Denoting, introduced the idea that ordinary language could be parsed into logical forms that reveal hidden quantifiers and variables. Wittgenstein, then a young man studying in Manchester under Russell's supervision, absorbed this insight with an almost reverential awe. Russell later recalled, "Wittgenstein was the most brilliant student I ever taught. He seemed to see the logical scaffolding of language as a child sees the bones of a fish." The teacher-student relationship between Russell and Wittgenstein was intense, marked by long evenings spent over tea, sketching logical diagrams, and debating the nature of propositions. Russell's influence is evident in the early drafts of what would become the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, where Wittgenstein adopts a picture-theoretic view of meaning that echoes both Frege's sense-reference distinction and Russell's analysis of descriptions. It was, however, the cataclysm of the First World War that would thrust Wittgenstein from the quiet of the university into a crucible of existential urgency. In 1914, he volunteered for the Austro-Hungarian army, a decision that surprised many of his contemporaries. The front lines of the Italian Alps became his new classroom, and the stark, frozen landscape of the Karst Plateau offered a brutal counterpoint to the abstract symbols on his notebook. Yet even amid artillery fire and the relentless mud, Wittgenstein's mind continued to work. He carried a notebook, later called the Tractatus manuscript, in a leather satchel, and would spend nights in the trenches, candle-lit, scribbling propositions that would later form the backbone of his seminal work. The first historical anecdote that illustrates the extraordinary circumstances of his discovery comes from the recollections of his fellow officer, Karl Popper, who later became a philosopher of science. Popper recalled that on a bleak winter evening, after a particularly fierce bombardment, Wittgenstein emerged from a shell hole clutching a bundle of paper. He said, "I have found the way out of all this confusion," Popper wrote, and he showed me a page where he had written, "The world is all that is the case." In that moment, the chaos of war seemed to crystallize into a single, austere proposition. Wittgenstein later described the experience in his own words. "In the silence after the shells, I saw the world as a set of facts, and the language as a ladder I could climb to reach them." That ladder, he believed, would be built from the logical scaffolding he was constructing in the trenches. The second anecdote concerns his post-war interactions with the Vienna Circle, a group of philosophers and scientists who gathered regularly at the Café Central to discuss the emerging doctrine of logical positivism. When Wittgenstein returned to Vienna in 1919, he was invited to present his manuscript to the Circle. The meeting was charged with anticipation. Moritz Schlick, the Circle's founder, had already heard of Wittgenstein's reputation as a mystic engineer. As Wittgenstein unfolded the pages, the Circle listened in hushed silence, punctuated only by the clink of coffee cups. After he finished, Schlick asked, "Is this not the very culmination of our project to eliminate metaphysics?" Wittgenstein's reply was both cryptic and profound. "What we cannot speak about we must pass over in silence." The tension in the room was palpable. Some members, like Rudolf Carnap, saw in the Tractatus a validation of their program, while others, like the young Karl Popper, sensed a deeper, perhaps unsettling, mysticism. The intensity of those discussions would shape the trajectory of analytic philosophy for decades to come, and the echoes of that night still reverberate in contemporary debates about the role of language in philosophy. Having set the stage, we can now turn to the core concepts of the Tractatus itself, beginning with the picture theory of language. Wittgenstein famously wrote, "A proposition is a picture of reality." By this, he meant that a proposition, in order to be meaningful, must share a logical form with the fact it depicts. Imagine, for a moment, a map of a city. The map contains symbols, lines for streets, dots for landmarks that correspond to features in the world. The map is not the city itself, but it can represent the city because it preserves the spatial relations. A road that runs north-south on the map corresponds to a road that runs north-south in reality. If the map were to rearrange those symbols arbitrarily, it would cease to be a picture of the city. The same principle applies to language. The structure of a proposition mirrors the structure of the fact it portrays. A second, perhaps more vivid illustration is the chessboard. A chessboard, with its black and white squares arranged in an 8x8 grid, can be used to model a particular arrangement of pieces. The pieces themselves, king, queen, rook, occupy specific squares, and their positions encode the state of the game at any moment. If we were to write down the positions in algebraic notation, e.g., Kion, Qdon, Rayon, that notation is a picture of the board's configuration. The notation is meaningful because it preserves the relational structure. The king is on Eon, the queen on Dun, and so forth. Change the notation arbitrarily, and it no longer corresponds to any real arrangement of pieces. Wittgenstein's picture theory thus insists that language, like a map or a chessboard, can only be meaningful when it reflects the logical scaffolding of the world. From the picture theory emerges the doctrine of logical atomism. Wittgenstein held that the world consists of atomic facts, simple, indivisible states of affairs, each of which can be expressed by elementary propositions. These elementary propositions combine, through logical operations, to form more complex sentences, just as elementary particles combine to form molecules. The logical form of a complex proposition is determined by the way its constituent elementary propositions are linked. In this view, the logical constants and, or, not, if, are not substantive content. They are the glue that holds the picture together. The truth conditions of a proposition are therefore a matter of whether the corresponding atomic facts obtain in the world. If they do, the proposition is true. If not, it is false. This atomistic picture underpins Wittgenstein's claim that the limits of language are the limits of our world. Indeed, the limits of language become a central theme in the Tractatus, culminating in the famously enigmatic proposition, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." The idea is that language can only meaningfully discuss that which can be pictured, i.e., the factual, the logical. Anything that lies beyond the bounds of logical representation, ethical values, aesthetics, the mystical, cannot be expressed in propositional language. They can only be shown, not said. Wittgenstein's mysticism here is subtle. He does not deny the existence of the mystical, he merely asserts that it is ineffable. The silence he prescribes is not a denial, but a recognition of the limits of our linguistic tools. To understand how these ideas intersect with the work of his predecessors, we must look closely at Frege's distinction between sense, sinn, and reference by Deutung. Frege argued that a term has both a sense, a mode of presentation, and a reference, the object it stands for. Wittgenstein's picture theory can be read as a response to this distinction. The sense of a proposition is its logical form, the picture that makes reference possible. When Wittgenstein says that a proposition pictures a fact, he is essentially saying that the sense of the proposition determines how it can refer to a state of affairs. The logical form, then, is the bridge between sense and reference. Moreover, Wittgenstein's focus on the structural correspondence between language and reality echoes Russell's theory of descriptions, especially the way Russell dissolved seemingly paradoxical sentences, such as "the present King of France is bald," into logical form. Russell showed that the meaning of a description could be analyzed into existential quantifiers and predicates, thereby revealing its truth conditions. Wittgenstein extends this analysis by insisting that the entire proposition, not just its components, must share a logical form with the fact it depicts. In this sense, the Tractatus can be seen as a synthesis of Frege's semantic insights and Russell's syntactic analysis, pushing both toward a more austere, picture-theoretic vision. Yet, as influential as the Tractatus was, it did not escape criticism. The first counter-argument we encounter comes from Rudolf Carnap, a leading figure of the Vienna Circle and a staunch advocate of logical positivism. Carnap admired Wittgenstein's rigor but took issue with the mystical conclusion. In his 1928 work, The Logical Structure of the World, Carnap argued that the proposition, "whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent," is itself a meaningful statement about the limits of language, and therefore, paradoxically, it violates its own rule. If the statement is true, it must be unsayable, but if it is unsayable, we cannot assert its truth. Carnap proposed a reformulation. Rather than a categorical silence, we should adopt a logical distinction between meaningful scientific language and non-empirical language, relegating the latter to the realm of logical syntax without ontological import. In other words, the mystical should be treated as pseudo-statements that can be eliminated by logical analysis, not as ineffable truths that demand silence. This critique opened a line of debate that would shape the logical positivist program throughout the 1930s. A second, more existential counter-argument comes from Martin Heidegger, whose phenomenological approach offered a stark contrast to Wittgenstein's analytic precision. In a 1929 lecture, Heidegger remarked, "Wittgenstein's ladder is built on the stone of being, yet he climbs only to the height of language and then throws it away." Heidegger challenged the picture theory on the grounds that language is not merely a tool for representing facts, but is constitutive of the world itself. For Heidegger, the being in the world of Dasein cannot be reduced to a set of atomic propositions. It is disclosed through moods, practices, and historicity, which resist the kind of logical atomism Wittgenstein proposes. Heidegger's critique suggests that the limits of language are not merely logical but existential. There are aspects of human existence, care, death, authenticity, that cannot be captured by any picture, however precise. This line of thought paved the way for later philosophers, such as Hans-Georg Gadamer and Paul Ricoeur, who emphasized hermeneutics and the interpretive nature of meaning. The tension between Wittgenstein's early logical vision and the later critiques of both Carnap and Heidegger illustrates a broader dialectic that continues to animate contemporary philosophy. On the one hand, the picture theory and logical atomism have found a lasting home in the philosophy of language, particularly in the work of philosophers like Saul Kripke, whose causal theory of reference revisits the relationship between language and the world. Kripke's famous Naming and Necessity lectures echo Wittgenstein's concern with how names latch onto objects, yet Kripke departs by allowing that the link between name and referent can be rigid across possible worlds, a nuance that Wittgenstein's original framework does not accommodate. On the other hand, the Heideggerian critique has inspired a resurgence of interest in the phenomenology of language, as seen in contemporary thinkers such as Hubert Dreyfus, who argue that meaning is rooted in embodied practice rather than abstract logical form. To see how these ideas play out in everyday contexts, consider a modern example, the use of GPS navigation. The GPS device presents a digital map on a screen, a picture that reflects the spatial relations of roads, traffic signals, and landmarks. When you input a destination, the device generates a route, a proposition about how you should move through space. The route is meaningful because the logical structure of the instructions, turn left, continue for 2 kilometers, mirrors the actual configuration of streets. Yet the GPS cannot convey the feeling of a neighborhood, the cultural significance of a particular street, or the personal memories attached to a place. Those aspects lie beyond the picture, in the realm of the ineffable, where Wittgenstein would advise silence. A second everyday illustration is the legal contract. A contract is a formal document that attempts to picture the obligations, rights, and conditions agreed upon by the parties. Each clause is a proposition that, ideally, corresponds to a possible state of affairs. If Party A delivers the goods, Party B shall pay the sum of X. The contract's logical form is designed to ensure that, should the stipulated facts obtain, the obligations follow. However, the contract cannot capture the underlying trust, the moral expectations, or the social context that give the agreement its full meaning. Those dimensions, again, reside outside the strict logical picture, reminding us that the limits of language are always present, even in our most precise legal instruments. Returning to the historical narrative, it is worth recalling another anecdote that reveals Wittgenstein's personal relationship with the very tools of logical analysis he so revered. While stationed in the Alpine trenches, he once found a discarded pocket watch among the debris of a shell crater. He repaired it with a piece of wire, and in the quiet moments before dawn, he would wind the watch and listen to its ticking. He later reflected that the watch's steady pulse reminded him of the logical rhythm that underlies all propositions. Each tick is a moment of truth, a fact that either obtains or does not. This small, personal ritual encapsulated his belief that logic was not an abstract game, but a lived experience, a metronome that measured the world's structure. The influence of the Austrian cultural milieu also deserves attention. Vienna at the turn of the century was a city of contradictions, a hub of imperial grandeur and a breeding ground for radical ideas. The coffee houses were laboratories of thought, where Freud's psychoanalysis, Klimt's symbolism, and Schoenberg's atonal music coexisted with the logical rigor of the Vienna Circle. Wittgenstein's own aesthetic sensibility, his love for music, his admiration for the clarity of a well-composed sonata, infused his logical work with a certain artistic elegance. He once wrote to his sister, "I feel that the logical propositions are like the notes of a piano piece. Each must be placed with exactness, lest the whole composition fall into discord." This intertwining of the artistic and the logical is a reminder that the Tractatus, while austere, was also a work of profound aesthetic ambition. In the years following the publication of the Tractatus in 1921, Wittgenstein's ideas underwent a remarkable transformation. He withdrew from academic philosophy, took up work as a schoolteacher, and later returned to Cambridge with a new set of concerns that would culminate in the philosophical investigations. Yet the early influences that shaped his first major work never fully disappeared. The logical rigor of Frege, the analytical precision of Russell, and the cultural ferment of Vienna continued to echo in his later reflections on language games, rule following, and the ordinary use of words. The Tractatus remains a landmark precisely because it captures a moment when the logical analysis of language seemed to promise a final solution to philosophical problems, a promise that, as the subsequent critiques of Carnap and Heidegger show, would prove both powerful and incomplete. When we consider the broader philosophical landscape, the Tractatus can be situated alongside other attempts to delineate the limits of thought. For instance, Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, written a century earlier, also posited that there are boundaries to what we can know, namely, the distinction between phenomena and noumena. Wittgenstein's Whereof One Cannot Speak can be read as a modern, linguistic articulation of Kant's noumenal realm, that which lies beyond the capacity of propositional language. Yet Wittgenstein departs from Kant by insisting that the unsayable is not a hidden reality awaiting discovery, but a recognition that our linguistic apparatus simply does not have the scaffolding to reach it. This shift from metaphysical speculation to linguistic analysis marks a key transition in early 20th century philosophy. The intellectual cross-references do not stop there. The logical positivists, inspired by the Tractatus, sought to eliminate metaphysics from scientific discourse, championing verificationism as a criterion of meaning. Carnap's The Logical Structure of the World attempted to construct a formal language that could reduce all scientific statements to a logical basis, a project that can be seen as an extension of Wittgenstein's atomistic ambition. Yet, as the later critiques demonstrate, the very act of formulating a verificationist principle reintroduces a meta-linguistic statement that cannot be verified within its own system, a paradox that mirrors Wittgenstein's own self-referential silence at the end of his book. Conversely, the existentialists, particularly Jean-Paul Sartre, would later argue that human freedom cannot be reduced to logical propositions. Sartre's notion that existence precedes essence stands in stark contrast to the picture theory's claim that meaning is fixed by logical form. While Wittgenstein might respond that Sartre's existential claims are indeed whereof one cannot speak, the dialogue between these traditions illustrates how the Tractatus continues to serve as a touchstone for debates about the relationship between language, reality, and human experience. In reflecting on Wittgenstein's early life, his wartime experiences, and the vibrant intellectual climate of Vienna, we see a tapestry of influences that converge in the Tractatus. The logical precision inherited from Frege and Russell, the cultural richness of a city at the crossroads of modernism, the crucible of war that forced a young mind to confront the stark facts of existence. All these elements coalesced into a work that, despite its brevity, continues to provoke, inspire, and challenge. The picture theory reminds us that language can serve as a map, a chessboard, a GPS device, or a contract, tools that help us navigate the world. Yet the limits of those tools, the places where we must remain silent, point to a realm of meaning that lies beyond the reach of propositional logic. As we close this segment, let us linger on Wittgenstein's own words from the final proposition of the Tractatus. My proposition, though in the form of a proposition, shows the limits of my language. As the limits of my language mean the limits of my world, so the limits of my world are also my limits. In a calm, reflective pause, we might ask ourselves, what are the limits of our own language? What facts, what experiences, what mysteries do we hold in silence? Perhaps the answer is not a definitive boundary, but an invitation to keep listening, to the ticking of the repaired watch, to the quiet rustle of a map's edge, to the unspoken resonance of a chessboard's squares. In doing so, we honor both the logical clarity that Wittgenstein sought and the ineffable depth that he chose to leave unsaid. When Ludwig Wittgenstein first arrived back in Cambridge after the war, the corridors of the university seemed to him both familiar and strangely altered, as if the very bricks had been rearranged by the passage of time and the weight of his own thoughts. He had spent the war years in rural Austria, teaching elementary school children, caring for his ailing brother, and confronting the stark realities of a world torn apart by conflict. Those experiences, together with the relentless inner scrutiny that had already driven him to the brink of mental collapse in his early 20s, began to reshape the way he thought about philosophy itself. No longer could he remain content with the austere, picture-theoretic vision he had set out in the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, a vision that treated language as a mirror of reality, a logical scaffolding that could be laid out in a perfect, crystalline structure. The war had shown him that human life, in its everyday messiness, could not be reduced to such a neat diagram. It was in the spring of 1947, when Wittgenstein walked once more through the porter's lodge and into the college, that the first tremors of his turn began to be felt. He took up a modest position as a fellow of Trinity College, but his true vocation was not the formal duties of a professor. It was the act of teaching itself, of standing before a small group of eager, often bewildered students and probing the ordinary ways in which they used words. In those early lectures, he would pause, look around the room, and ask, "What does it mean to say, 'I understand'?" The question hung in the air, and the students, including a young GEM. Anscombe, would feel the weight of it settle on their shoulders. Anscombe, who would later become one of his most faithful interpreters, remembered how Wittgenstein would often begin a lecture by turning the blackboard upside down, erasing the previous formulae, and then writing a single, simple sentence. We must look at the way language is actually used. That single injunction was the seed of a new philosophical method, one that would come to be known as the investigation of language games. The shift was not merely academic. It was profoundly personal. Wittgenstein had always been a man of extremes, oscillating between the rigor of logical analysis and the depths of existential anxiety. The war had forced him to confront the limits of his own language, the silence that fell over his mind when he tried to articulate the horror of the bombings he had witnessed from a distance. In his private notebooks he wrote, "The world is not a collection of facts to be mapped. It is a lived practice, a flow of activities in which we are immersed." This sentence, half written, half scrawled, encapsulates the essence of what would later be called forms of life. For Wittgenstein, a form of life is the background of shared human practices that makes any meaningful use of language possible. It is the cultural, historical, and practical context that gives words their force. Without such a backdrop, the logical scaffolding of the Tractatus would be an empty shell. One of the most vivid anecdotes that illustrates this new orientation is the famous beetle in a box thought experiment. Wittgenstein asked his students to imagine a scenario in which each person has a private box, and inside each box there is something, perhaps a beetle, perhaps nothing at all. The crucial point, he said, is that no one can look into anyone else's box. Yet we all use the word beetle in the same way, even though we have no way of verifying what, if anything, is inside the other boxes. The point of the story is not to deny the existence of private experiences, but to show that the meaning of a word does not depend on a private, inner referent. The word beetle acquires its meaning from the public language game we play, from the way we point, describe, and respond to one another. In a calm voice, Wittgenstein would let the thought linger. If the word beetle could refer to something utterly private, how could we ever be sure that we are speaking the same language? The silence that followed was as instructive as any answer. The beetle story, later recorded in the Philosophical Investigations as Section 242, became a cornerstone for the argument against a private language, a language whose words refer to sensations that are, by definition, inaccessible to anyone else. That anecdote is not an isolated curiosity. It is intimately connected to the heated debate that Wittgenstein once had with Karl Popper at the Moral Sciences Club in October 1947. The club, a venerable forum for philosophers, had gathered in the small, wood-paneled room of the University of Cambridge, and the evening's agenda seemed routine until Wittgenstein, with his characteristic intensity, rose to challenge Popper's paper on the demarcation problem, how to distinguish science from non-science. Popper, ever the advocate of falsifiability, argued that scientific theories must be testable, that they could be refuted by empirical evidence. Wittgenstein, however, interrupted, "If a theory is not a rule for the game of language, then it is not a theory at all." He then turned to the audience and asked, "What does it mean to say that a statement is meaningless? Is it not perhaps that we have no rule for using it?" The debate escalated, with Popper famously retorting, "I would like to have the privilege of being wrong." Wittgenstein's reply, "That would be the first step toward the truth," has been quoted endlessly. The episode, recorded by the club's secretaries, captures the clash between two philosophical temperaments: Popper's externalist, scientific realism, and Wittgenstein's internalist, rule-following perspective. It also crystallized the idea that philosophical problems often arise when we misuse language, treating it as a rigid system rather than a flexible game. So what exactly is a language game? Wittgenstein introduced the term in the opening sections of the Philosophical Investigations to convey the idea that language is not a monolithic entity, but a collection of diverse activities, each with its own set of rules, purposes, and contexts. Imagine a kitchen bustling with cooks shouting orders, tasting sauces, and adjusting heat. In that environment, the word salt is not a static label. It is a cue that triggers a series of actions, adding, tasting, balancing flavors. The game here is culinary practice, and the rules are learned through apprenticeship, through watching, through doing. Contrast this with the language of mathematics, where the symbol follows a precise, formally defined rule set that allows us to compute sums. The two settings illustrate how the same word or symbol can belong to entirely different language games, each governed by its own standards of correctness. In the kitchen, "add a pinch of salt" is a rule that can be interpreted flexibly, depending on taste, cultural norms, and even the particular dish being prepared. In mathematics, sum sign I equals 1, n I equals n, n plus 1/2 is a rule that admits no such flexibility. Any deviation is a mistake, not a matter of style. The notion of rule following is central to Wittgenstein's later philosophy. He asks, how does one learn to follow a rule? The answer is not a private mental act, but a public practice. To follow a rule is to act in accordance with a pattern that can be recognized by others within a form of life. Consider a child learning to say hello. The child does not infer a hidden mental representation of the greeting. Rather, the child observes how adults use the word, receives corrective feedback, and gradually internalizes the practice. The rule is not a mental formula, but a shared activity. Wittgenstein emphasizes that the possibility of following a rule cannot be reduced to a private mental state, because any attempt to do so would lead to an infinite regress. If each application of the rule requires a further rule to interpret it, we would never reach a point where the rule is actually applied. The rule is anchored in the communal context, in the form of life that gives it meaning. Wittgenstein's teaching style embodied this insight. He would sit on the floor, sometimes on a wooden stool, and invite students to bring in everyday language puzzles, a phrase like "the morning star is the evening star," or a paradox such as the rule that says, "never use a word in the same sense twice." He would then encourage the class to examine how those sentences function in ordinary speech, how they are used in various contexts, and what the consequences are when they are taken out of context. P.F. Strawson, another of his Cambridge colleagues, recalled how Wittgenstein would pause after a student's answer, stare intently, and then ask, "And what would happen if we tried to apply that rule in a different situation?" The pause was not a silence of indecision, but a deliberate space for the mind to notice the shift from one language game to another, to see the underlying form of life that made the rule intelligible. The Philosophical Investigations is in many ways a collection of such pauses, a series of numbered remarks that each open a window onto ordinary language. In section 43, Wittgenstein writes, "The meaning of a word is its use in the language." This seemingly simple claim overturns the picture-theoretic notion that words stand for objects in a one-to-one correspondence. Instead, meaning is a matter of function, of what we do with words in the flow of life. In section 65, he adds, "To imagine a language as a set of names attached to objects is like trying to understand a game by looking only at the pieces." The metaphor of the game recurs. reinforcing the idea that the rules of a language are not abstract entities but lived practices. Of course, such a radical reorientation did not go unchallenged. One of the most prominent objections came from Donald Davidson, who, while sharing Wittgenstein's interest in the public nature of language, argued that the private language objection was insufficient to explain how we can have genuine, systematic meaning. Davidson's triangulation argument posits that speakers coordinate their language by referring to a shared external world, and that this external world provides the necessary constraints for meaning. In other words, meaning is not merely a matter of rule following within a community. It is also grounded in the fact that we are all trying to describe the same reality. Davidson would ask, if language games are merely social conventions, how do we avoid the charge that they are arbitrary? He suggests that the success of our communication, our ability to predict and act upon each other's utterances, offers a pragmatic check on arbitrariness. This critique forces us to consider whether Wittgenstein's emphasis on the form of life might underplay the role of an external world that we collectively engage with. A second, more politically charged objection arises from the charge of relativism. If meaning is determined by the particular language game we are playing, does that not imply that any claim to truth is merely a matter of local convention? Critics such as Hilary Putnam have taken this concern seriously. Putnam, in his later work on internal realism, acknowledges Wittgenstein's insight that meaning is use-dependent, but he warns that without a robust account of how different language games relate to one another, we risk fragmenting the world into incompatible linguistic islands. Putnam offers the example of scientific discourse versus everyday conversation. While the former follows strict methodological rules, the latter is more fluid, yet both can converge on shared facts about the world. For instance, the temperature of a room can be expressed both in lay terms, it feels warm, and in precise scientific language, the temperature is 22 degrees Celsius. Putnam argues that the bridge between the games is provided by the notion of reference that is both socially negotiated and anchored in the world. In this way, he seeks to preserve the anti-relativist stance while still honoring Wittgenstein's insight that meaning is not a static mirror but a dynamic practice. The influence of Wittgenstein's turn can be traced forward to the ordinary language philosophy of J.L. Austin. Austin, in his How to Do Things with Words, takes up the same premise that philosophical puzzles often dissolve when we attend to the ordinary uses of language. He distinguishes between constative statements that describe states of affairs and performative utterances that do something in the act of speaking, promising, ordering, apologizing. Austin's speech act theory can be seen as an elaboration of Wittgenstein's language game concept. Each speech act is a rule-governed activity embedded in a form of life. Austin's famous example of the bachelor illustrates how a word's meaning is not a fixed definition, but a pattern of use that can shift in different contexts, much as Wittgenstein's beetle story shows the limits of private reference. Beyond philosophy, contemporary cognitive science has taken up the meaning as use thesis in the study of embodied cognition and language acquisition. Researchers in developmental psychology observe that infants learn words not by mapping them onto abstract symbols, but by participating in joint attention activities, pointing, gesturing, sharing focus on objects. This empirical work mirrors Wittgenstein's claim that language is inseparable from the practices in which it is embedded. In neuroscience, studies of mirror neurons suggest that understanding another's speech involves simulating the motor actions associated with that speech, again underscoring the link between language and lived activity. These findings lend a kind of empirical weight to Wittgenstein's philosophical insight, that the mind does not operate on detached, amodal symbols, but on patterns of interaction that are grounded in the body and the world. Returning to the personal dimension of Wittgenstein's turn, it is worth recalling the story of his first lecture after the war, delivered to a group that included Anscombe, Strawson, and a few other graduate students. He entered the lecture room without notes, placed a single sheet of paper on the table, and wrote, "What is the use of a rule?" He then asked the students to think of a rule they use every day. One raised his hand and said, "The rule that a traffic light turns red, we must stop." Wittgenstein smiled and after a pause replied, "And yet, when a police officer raises a hand, we may go on." The rule is not the color of the light alone, it is the whole practice of traffic regulation, the shared understanding that the officer's gesture overrides the light. This anecdote illustrates how Wittgenstein's later philosophy dissolves the sharp boundary between formal rule and lived exception. The rule is not a static algorithm, but a living practice that can accommodate nuance, authority, and context. Another anecdote, recounted by Gem Anscombe in her memoir, involves Wittgenstein's fascination with the game of chess. He would sit in the common room, watching students play, and would remark, "In chess, the rules are explicit, but the meaning of a move depends on the whole situation of the board. A queen's move can be a threat, a defense, or a sacrifice, depending on the broader strategy." He then asked, "What does it mean to play chess well? Is it to follow the rules perfectly, or to understand the form of life of the game, the patterns of attack and defense that have developed over centuries?" The answer, he implied, lay not in a formal proof, but in the shared expertise of the community of players. This chess analogy later became a staple in discussions of rule following because it captures both the precision of formal systems and the fluidity of practice. Wittgenstein's shift also had a profound impact on his own writing style. The Tractatus reads like a logical ladder, each proposition building upon the previous, culminating in a concise, almost mystical conclusion: "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." In contrast, the Investigations is a mosaic of short, numbered remarks, each opening a space for contemplation rather than a strict logical deduction. The change is not merely aesthetic, it mirrors the philosophical move from a world of static facts to a world of dynamic practices. In the Investigations, Wittgenstein often uses the phrase, as if to signal that he is not presenting a final theory, but an invitation to look at how we actually behave. He writes, "We must not think that the meaning of a word is something hidden behind the word, but that it is the way the word is used." This shift in style encourages the listener to adopt a reflective stance, to notice the ordinary movements of language that we normally take for granted. To bring these ideas into a concrete, everyday setting, consider the simple act of giving orders in a kitchen. A head chef says, "Sauce the fish, then plate it." The words sauce and plate are not abstract definitions. They trigger a cascade of bodily actions: grabbing a ladle, pouring, adjusting temperature, arranging the dish. The rule governing these actions is learned through apprenticeship, through watching others, through trial and error. If a new apprentice misinterprets sauce as add a garnish, the dish will be wrong, but the correction is immediate because the community of cooks shares an expectation about the outcome. Contrast this with the language of mathematics, where the symbol integral commands a precise operation: integrate a function over a specified interval. The rule is explicit, the steps are codified, and there is little room for improvisation. Yet even in mathematics, the meaning of a symbol is sustained by a community of mathematicians who practice the discipline, who agree on the conventions, who teach the symbols to new generations. Both examples illustrate Wittgenstein's claim that meaning is rooted in use, whether the use is fluid and context-dependent, as in the kitchen, or highly regimented, as in mathematics. The idea of forms of life further expands this picture. Wittgenstein suggests that the myriad language games we engage in are undergirded by a shared human way of being, a form of life. This is not a vague cultural notion, but a concrete set of practices, habits, and bodily engagements that make communication possible. For instance, the form of life of a scientific community includes peer review, replication, and the use of specialized jargon, while the form of life of a religious congregation includes ritual, prayer, and shared narratives. Both are language games, but they draw upon different aspects of human life, different histories, different values, different bodily routines. The form of life provides the scaffolding that allows the language game to function. Without it, the rules would be empty. When we examine the historical context of Wittgenstein's turn, we see that it resonates with broader intellectual currents of the mid-20th century. The logical positivists of the Vienna Circle, with whom Wittgenstein had initially been associated, were still seeking a unified scientific language, a universal logical syntax that could eliminate metaphysics. Wittgenstein's later work, however, points out that such a universal language is a fantasy, because language is always already embedded in particular practices. This critique anticipated the later linguistic turn in the humanities, where scholars began to see discourse as performative, as constructing reality rather than merely describing it. Yet the turn also sparked fierce resistance. Some philosophers, especially those committed to a more traditional analytic program, argued that Wittgenstein had abandoned the rigorous analysis that had made philosophy a respectable discipline. They claimed that by focusing on everyday language, he had surrendered to relativism, that the notion of language games implied that any claim could be justified within its own context, and that there was no objective yardstick for truth. This criticism found a voice in the work of philosophers like Michael Dummett, who argued that the loss of a clear semantic theory threatened the possibility of meaningful philosophical argument. In response, Wittgenstein's defenders, drawing on the later writings of Putnam and the pragmatic tradition, emphasized that the yardstick is precisely the practice of rational discourse itself, a practice that is itself a language game, governed by standards that are open to critique and revision. The debate over private language also resurfaced in the 1970s with the rise of phenomenology and the work of philosophers such as Thomas Nagel, who asked, "What is it like to be a bat?" Nagel's point was that there might be aspects of subjective experience that are inaccessible to external description. Wittgenstein's beetle argument seems to say that such private experiences, while perhaps real, cannot be the basis of meaning. Donald Davidson's triangulation response suggests that we can nonetheless talk about them because we coordinate our language around observable behavior and shared world. The tension between these positions continues to animate contemporary discussions in philosophy of mind, especially in debates over qualia and the hard problem of consciousness. In contemporary cognitive science, the meaning as use perspective has found an ally in the theory of predictive processing. This theory posits that the brain constantly generates predictions about sensory input and updates them based on error signals. Language, in this view, is a predictive system that anticipates the flow of discourse. The rules of a language game are the statistical regularities that the brain learns through exposure. When a child hears the word dog, the brain predicts the associated visual and auditory features, the typical actions, petting, walking, and the social contexts in which the word appears. This predictive model aligns with Wittgenstein's claim that meaning is rooted in use. The brain's predictions are shaped by the forms of life that the child participates in. Moreover, the brain's ability to adjust predictions when faced with novel uses, such as metaphor or irony, mirrors Wittgenstein's idea that language games are flexible and evolve over time. Wittgenstein's influence also extends to the field of artificial intelligence. Early symbolic AI attempted to model language as a set of formal rules, much like the logical picture of the Tractatus. However, as AI research progressed, scholars recognized that purely rule-based systems struggled with the fluidity of natural language. Connectionist approaches, which learn from large corpora of text, embody a kind of meaning as use. The system derives the meaning of a word from the patterns of co-occurrence in real language use. While these models are far from capturing the full richness of human forms of life, they illustrate a shift toward the Wittgensteinian insight that language cannot be fully understood without reference to its everyday employment. The personal relationships Wittgenstein cultivated during his Cambridge years also shaped his philosophical development. Gem Anscombe, for example, not only recorded his lectures but also challenged him to clarify his thoughts on ethics, leading to his later reflections on the nature of rule following in moral contexts. In one of their conversations, she asked, "If there are no private mental states that can ground moral rules, how do we justify saying that lying is wrong?" Wittgenstein replied, "We do not need a private mental state. We need a community that shares the practice of trusting one another." This exchange underscores how the private language objection is not merely a technical point, but a hinge on which our moral practices turn. Similarly, P.F. Strawson's work on descriptive metaphysics, his analysis of the basic concepts that underlie our ordinary judgments, bears the imprint of Wittgenstein's insistence that philosophy should begin where everyday life leaves off. The heated debate with Karl Popper at the Moral Sciences Club also left a lasting imprint on the way philosophers think about the demarcation of science. Popper's falsifiability criterion, while powerful, presupposes a clear notion of what counts as a scientific rule. Wittgenstein's challenge, "If a theory is not a rule for the game of language, then it is not a theory at all," invites us to ask what the language game of science actually looks like. Is it a game with strict rules, or is it a family of overlapping practices, experiment, theory construction, peer review, that evolve over time? The modern philosophy of science, especially the work of Thomas Kuhn on paradigms, can be read as an extension of Wittgenstein's insight. Scientific communities operate within language games that shift during revolutions, and the meaning of scientific terms changes as the form of life of the scientific community evolves. Wittgenstein's turn also resonates with the later development of hermeneutics, particularly the work of Hans-Georg Gadamer. Gadamer's notion of the fusion of horizons, the process by which our understanding is shaped by the historical and cultural context in which we interpret a text, parallels Wittgenstein's claim that meaning is always situated within a form of life. Both philosophers reject the idea of a timeless, context-free meaning. Gadamer, however, places more emphasis on the historicity of interpretation, whereas Wittgenstein focuses on the ordinary, everyday practices that give rise to meaning. The dialogue between these traditions enriches our appreciation of how language functions as both a tool and a medium of human life. In the final analysis, the turn from the logical structure of the Tractatus to the language games of the philosophical investigations is not simply a change of subject matter. It is a profound reorientation of philosophy's method and its self-understanding. It moves philosophy away from the aspiration to construct a perfect, all-encompassing logical picture toward a humble, attentive listening to the ways in which we actually speak, act, and live together. Wittgenstein's personal journey, his wartime experiences, his return to Cambridge, his intense teaching, his dialogues with Anscombe, Strawson, Popper, mirrors this philosophical shift. The anecdotes of the beetle in a box and the Popper debate serve as vivid illustrations of the stakes involved. Whether we see language as a private, internal system or as a public, rule-governed activity has consequences for how we understand mind, meaning, and even morality. The core ideas, language games, forms of life, rule-following continue to echo across disciplines. Ordinary language philosophers like J.L. Austin took up the task of teasing apart the ordinary uses of words, showing how many philosophical puzzles dissolve when we examine the rules of the game. Cognitive scientists now investigate how the brain encodes these rules, how children acquire them, and how cultural variation shapes them. Critics such as Donald Davidson and Hilary Putnam sharpen the debate, reminding us that the public nature of language must be balanced against the need for shared reference and against the danger of relativism. Their objections do not overturn Wittgenstein's insights, rather they deepen them, urging us to refine the picture of language as a lived practice that is both socially grounded and world-directed. As we reflect on Wittgenstein's turn, we might ask ourselves, what language games are we playing right now as we listen to this narration? Are we merely passive recipients, or are we actively interpreting, questioning, and perhaps reshaping the rules that govern our understanding? The answer, perhaps, lies in the very act of listening, a form of life that involves attention, anticipation, and the willingness to be corrected. In that sense, the philosophical investigations remains an invitation, a gentle challenge to keep looking at the ordinary, to keep asking how our words work, and to remember that the meaning of a word is never a fixed object hidden behind it, but the living practice of using it in the world. When we turn our attention to the philosophical investigations, we find ourselves stepping into a landscape that is at once familiar and profoundly unsettling. Ludwig Wittgenstein is no longer the austere logician of the Tractatus. He is now a guide who invites us to wander through the ordinary folds of language, to listen to the way words live in our everyday practices, and to notice the cracks that appear when we try to turn those practices into abstract theories. The central motifs that emerge from the investigations, the critique of private language, the conception of meaning as use, and the therapeutic aim of philosophy, form a triad that reshapes not only how we think about language, but also how we understand the limits of philosophy itself. In what follows, we will walk through these themes slowly, pausing at each turn to consider illustrative cases, historical anecdotes, and the objections that have kept the conversation alive for decades. Let us begin with the notion that meaning is not a hidden essence waiting to be uncovered, but a function of use. Wittgenstein famously writes, "For a word is its use in the language," section 43. The image he offers is not that of a static dictionary entry, but of a living activity. To grasp this, imagine a carpenter's toolbox. In the carpenter's hands, a hammer, a chisel, a plane. Each tool has a purpose that is revealed only when the carpenter applies it to a piece of wood. The hammer does not possess an intrinsic hammerness that exists apart from the act of driving nails. Its identity is constituted by the way it is employed. Likewise, a word acquires its meaning precisely through the myriad ways in which speakers wield it. When we speak of game, we do not refer to a single abstract definition that could be listed in a lexicon. Instead, we recognize a family of activities, chess, football, tag, role-playing, that share a certain form of life, a pattern of moves, rules, and purposes. The grammar of language in Wittgenstein's sense is the set of these patterns, the ways in which words fit together, just as the carpenter's grammar consists of the ways his tools interlock, complement, and sometimes replace one another. This analogy does more than illustrate meaning as use. It also foregrounds the idea that language, like a set of tools, is embedded in a form of life, a cultural, historical, and practical context that cannot be reduced to a set of inner representations. When we try to isolate a word from its surrounding practices, we risk turning it into a private token, a symbol whose significance is known only to its owner. Wittgenstein's critique of private language hinges on this point. In section 259, he asks, if a person were to say that he has a private language, would it be a language at all? The answer for Wittgenstein is no, because language is inherently social. A private language would lack the public criteria that allow us to say whether a use is correct or mistaken. The very possibility of correctness presupposes a shared grammar, a set of standards that can be appealed to by others. Without that, the notion of meaning collapses. To see the danger of private language more concretely, consider the thought experiment of a person who keeps a diary in which he records sensations of a particular shade of pain. Calling it S, he claims that S refers to a private, ineffable experience that no one else can understand. Yet when he later tries to report that experience to another person, there is no way for the listener to verify whether the word S is being used consistently. The diary entries lack external criteria for correctness. Wittgenstein would say that the diary does not contain a language at all, but merely a private notation system that cannot fulfill the function of language, to be a rule-governed activity that can be judged by a community. The rule-following paradox sharpens this insight. Imagine a sequence of numbers 1, 2, 3. The rule seems obvious, add 1. But suppose a student, after learning the rule, continues the sequence as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then at some point decides to write 6, 8, 11, 15, following a different pattern that still agrees with the initial terms. Both the standard addition rule and the alternative rule are compatible with the first few numbers. How can we say that the student is following the rule of adding 1 rather than the alternative rule? Wittgenstein's answer is that rule following is not a matter of private mental states, but of participation in a practice. The community of mathematicians, by virtue of shared standards, judges the continuation as correct when it conforms to the addition rule. The private continuation that jumps to 6, 8, 11, 15 is not a legitimate application of the rule because it cannot be justified within the shared practice. The paradox thus reveals that the very notion of a rule is inseparable from the public context that sustains it. Wittgenstein's therapeutic aim emerges from these insights. He repeatedly describes philosophy as a therapy for the confusions that arise when language is misused. In section 113 he writes, "Philosophy is a battle against the bewitching of our intelligence by the language. The aim is not to construct a new metaphysical system, but to dissolve the puzzles that arise when we take language out of its ordinary context and treat it as if it were a rigid object. By showing us that many philosophical problems are, in fact, linguistic misunderstandings, Wittgenstein hopes to free us from the bewilderment that comes from such misapplications." A vivid historical anecdote illustrates this therapeutic impulse. In the winter of 1935, Wittgenstein kept a diary in which he recorded a moment of acute crisis. "I have been looking at the word meaning all day, and the more I look, the more I see it dissolve. The word seems to be a ghost that haunts the corridors of my thought. I cannot find a place where it stands solidly." This entry captures the very tension that drives the investigations. The realization that the traditional philosophical quest for a fixed essence of meaning leads nowhere, because the word itself is not a static entity but a moving target shaped by use. The diary entry is not a theoretical treatise. It is a personal note that signals the beginning of a therapeutic project, an attempt to let the word meaning breathe in its ordinary surroundings rather than imprison it in abstract definition. Another anecdote, this one from Wittgenstein's teaching career, shows how his therapeutic method played out in real time. While delivering a lecture on the nature of logical form at Cambridge in 1947, he suddenly halted, turned to the audience, and said, "I am sorry, but I cannot continue. The point I was about to make is a mistake of language." He walked out of the hall, leaving the students bewildered. Later, one of his pupils recounted that Wittgenstein had realized mid-sentence that he was about to treat a grammatical rule as if it were a metaphysical law. By withdrawing, he demonstrated in the most dramatic fashion that philosophy should not press forward when it is built on a linguistic illusion. The episode is a living illustration of his claim that philosophy is not a doctrine to be taught, but a cure to be administered, and that the therapist must sometimes stop the treatment when the patient is being misled. Having set the stage, let us turn to the objections that have kept the investigations alive as a site of debate. The first major counter-argument comes from Karl Popper, who, in his Conjectures and Refutations, accuses Wittgenstein of undermining the very foundations of scientific explanation. Popper writes, "If the meaning of a scientific term is nothing more than its use in a particular language game, then the objectivity that science requires is reduced to a mere consensus of linguistic practices." Popper worries that Wittgenstein's anti-essentialism, his denial that there is a hidden essence behind a term, threatens the possibility of a theory that can refer to a reality independent of our linguistic conventions. In other words, if the term gravity is just a tool used in a particular language game, how can we claim that it points to a real force that exists beyond the game? Popper's concern is that without a stable referent, scientific theories become nothing more than social agreements, and the rigorous testing that distinguishes science from mere opinion is lost. Wittgenstein's response, though never formulated as a direct rebuttal, can be gleaned from his later remarks on the nature of scientific language. He acknowledges that scientific terms are indeed part of a language game, but he also emphasizes that the game itself is constrained by empirical success. In the investigations, he notes, the meaning of a proposition is its place in a language game, and the language game is guided by the way the world responds to it. The success of a scientific theory, then, is not a private verification but a public communal test. The theory must work in practice, must predict phenomena, must be integrated into the broader network of scientific activities. The use of a term like gravity is not arbitrary. It is anchored by the shared practice of measurement, experimentation, and technological application. In this sense, Wittgenstein's view does not dissolve scientific objectivity. Rather, it relocates it within a communal practice that is, nevertheless, responsive to the world. The second objection is raised by John McDowell, who argues that Wittgenstein's therapeutic method is itself a philosophical theory, and therefore cannot escape the very critique it levies against other philosophical systems. In Mind and World, McDowell writes, Wittgenstein's claim that philosophy is therapy presupposes a meta-philosophical stance on what philosophy ought to be. If Wittgenstein is prescribing a particular role for philosophy, namely, the dissolution of conceptual confusions, then he is offering a normative account, which is itself a philosophical doctrine. McDowell worries that this move reintroduces the very metaphysical baggage Wittgenstein sought to avoid. To address this, we can observe that Wittgenstein's therapy is not presented as a set of propositional doctrines, but as a method of attentiveness. He repeatedly urges the philosopher to look at the way language works, see section 84, and to stop when a philosophical problem turns out to be a misuse of language, see section 126. The therapeutic stance is not a theory about the world, it is an attitude toward the practice of philosophy itself. It is akin to a surgeon's decision to cease an operation when the patient's condition worsens. The method does not claim a universal principle that can be codified, it is a particular response to particular confusions. In this way, the therapeutic approach can be seen as a meta-philosophical reflection that is itself free of the metaphysical pretensions it critiques, because it does not posit a new set of essentialist claims about meaning, but merely points back to the ordinary use of language as the arbiter of sense. The conversation does not stop with Popper and McDowell. Later thinkers have taken Wittgenstein's insights in new directions, most notably Jacques Derrida. Derrida's deconstruction, while often portrayed as a radical relativism, shares with Wittgenstein a suspicion of fixed meanings. Derrida famously declares that there is nothing outside the text, from of grammatology, echoing Wittgenstein's claim that meaning is bound up in the grammar of language games. Yet Derrida pushes further, suggesting that the play of difference, destabilizes any final grounding, even the communal practices that Wittgenstein emphasizes. Where Wittgenstein sees the community as the source of stability, Derrida sees the community as itself caught in an endless chain of signifiers. This tension has sparked a lively debate. Does Derrida's radical iterability undermine the possibility of any shared criteria for correct use, or does it simply extend Wittgenstein's insight into the dynamic, never complete nature of language? Contemporary discussions on linguistic relativism also echo Wittgenstein's concerns. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, for instance, proposes that the language we speak shapes the way we think. Wittgenstein would likely agree that language influences our forms of life, but he would caution against turning this influence into a deterministic law. In the investigations, he observes that the limits of my language mean the limits of my world, though this line is often misquoted from the Tractatus. What he adds is that the limits are not rigid borders, but flexible horizons that can be expanded through new language games. This perspective offers a nuanced middle ground. Language does affect cognition, yet the effect is mediated by the fluid, rule-governed practices that can be revised, extended, or abandoned. Let us return now to the illustrative cases to see how they illuminate the central themes in concrete terms. The carpenter's toolbox analogy, introduced earlier, can be deepened by examining how a carpenter learns to choose the right tool. A novice might pick up a hammer to carve a delicate joint, only to discover that the hammer's impact bruises the wood. Through experience, the carpenter learns that the chisel, not the hammer, is appropriate for that task. This learning process is not about discovering an abstract definition of hammer-ness or chisel-ness, but about participating in a practice where the consequences of each action provide feedback. Similarly, when we use a word like justice, we learn its appropriate applications by seeing how it functions in legal discourse, moral argument, and everyday conversation. The grammar of justice is the network of situations in which the word can be correctly employed, and the feedback we receive when we misuse it, confusion, criticism, or correction, serves as the carpenter's bruised wood. The rule-following paradox with the number sequence offers a second, more abstract illustration. Suppose a child learns the rule add 1 by practicing with a set of flashcards, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The child internalizes the pattern, but later, when asked to continue the sequence, the child writes 6, 8, 11, 15, claiming that the rule is increased by the next natural number. The child's mistake is not a failure of memory, but a failure to recognize that the rule they are following is embedded in a community of mathematicians who have agreed that the continuation should be 6, 7, 8, 9. The child's alternative sequence is a new rule, but it does not inherit the authority of the original one, because it lacks the communal endorsement that validates the add 1 rule. This example shows that rule following is not a private mental operation. It is a public practice that is sustained by shared standards, corrective feedback, and the possibility of disagreement that can be resolved by appeal to the community's grammar. Now let us consider the real-world applications of these ideas. In the field of law, for instance, judges often grapple with the problem of interpreting statutes. A literalist approach attempts to treat the words of a law as having a fixed, essential meaning, much like the metaphysical view Wittgenstein critiques. A more Wittgensteinian approach would attend to the use of the statutory language within the broader legal practice, how lawyers, judges, and citizens have historically applied it, the purposes it serves, and the consequences of different interpretations. By focusing on use rather than essence, the judge can avoid the trap of private language, the illusion that the law speaks a private, immutable meaning that can be uncovered by a solitary mind. In the realm of artificial intelligence, especially natural language processing, Wittgenstein's insights have become increasingly relevant. Machine learning models often treat words as vectors in high-dimensional space, capturing statistical patterns of co-occurrence. Yet these models can miss the pragmatic dimension of use that Wittgenstein emphasizes. When a chatbot interprets the phrase, "I'm feeling blue," as a literal statement about color, it demonstrates a failure to grasp the language game in which blue functions as an idiom for sadness. Designers of AI systems are now turning to grounded language learning, where meaning is tied to interaction with the world, echoing Wittgenstein's claim that meaning is rooted in use. This shift reflects a move from a purely formalist view of language to one that acknowledges the role of practice, context, and embodiment. The therapeutic aim of philosophy also finds a modern counterpart in the practice of cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. CBT often involves identifying the language games that underlie maladaptive thoughts, and then restructuring them by exposing the ways in which they deviate from ordinary usage. For example, a patient who thinks "I must be perfect" can be guided to see how the word "must" is usually used in contexts of external obligation, not internal self-imposition. By altering the linguistic framework, the therapist helps the patient dissolve the philosophical confusion that fuels anxiety. Wittgenstein would likely have appreciated this approach, as it mirrors his method of dissolving philosophical problems by showing how they arise from a misuse of language. Cross-referencing with later thinkers enriches our understanding of Wittgenstein's legacy. Besides Derrida, the American philosopher Hilary Putnam offers a useful comparison. Putnam's meaning is use thesis, articulated in his twin earth thought experiment, aligns with Wittgenstein's view that the content of a term is determined by its role in the linguistic community. Yet Putnam also defends a semantic externalism that stresses the causal relationship between words and the world, a nuance that Wittgenstein only hints at when he says that the meaning of a proposition is its place in a language game that is guided by the way the world responds to it. Both philosophers converge on the idea that meaning cannot be captured by introspection alone, but diverge on how strongly they tie language to external reality. The debate over linguistic relativism also brings us into dialogue with philosophers such as Noam Chomsky, who argues for an innate universal grammar that underlies all human languages. Wittgenstein would likely view Chomsky's universal grammar as another form of essentialism, a hidden structure that the philosopher seeks to uncover. While Wittgenstein does not deny that there are regularities across languages, he would caution against treating these regularities as metaphysical foundations. Instead, he would ask us to look at the specific ways in which language is used in different forms of life, and to see the grammar as a set of practices rather than a set of innate rules. Returning now to the historical anecdotes, we see how they illuminate the lived dimension of Wittgenstein's thought. The 1935 diary entry, with its raw expression of linguistic crisis, reveals a philosopher in the midst of a profound transformation. It shows that the move from the Tractatus to the Investigations was not a calm, systematic revision, but a painful, almost existential struggle with the very words he had previously taken for granted. This personal turmoil underscores the therapeutic character of his later work. He was not merely proposing a new theory. He was trying to heal his own philosophical wounds, and by extension, the wounds of anyone who had been misled by the bewitching of language. The episode of Wittgenstein leaving the lecture hall mid-speech provides a vivid illustration of his commitment to the therapeutic method. By abruptly halting a lecture, he demonstrated that philosophical discourse must be responsive to the moment when language begins to betray its purpose. The students who witnessed this were forced to confront the idea that philosophy is not a linear argument to be followed, but a dynamic process that can be interrupted when it ceases to serve clarity. This act also anticipates modern pedagogical approaches that emphasize dialogical learning over didactic transmission. Having explored the core themes, illustrative cases, historical moments, and critical objections, we can now reflect on how the Investigations continues to inform contemporary debates. In the field of ethics, for example, the rise of moral particularism resonates with Wittgenstein's insistence that moral terms are used differently across contexts. Particularists argue that there are no fixed moral principles that apply universally. Instead, moral judgment depends on the particulars of each situation, a view that mirrors Wittgenstein's claim that the meaning of a word is its use. Critics, however, warn that without stable principles, moral discourse risks descending into relativism. Wittgenstein's therapeutic approach would suggest that the dispute itself may be a linguistic confusion. We are treating moral language as if it were a formal system, when it is in fact a set of practices that guide our actions. In the philosophy of mind, the language of thought hypothesis, often associated with Jerry Fodor, posits that thinking occurs in a mental language, mentalese, that is private and syntactically structured. Wittgenstein's private language argument directly challenges this view. If meaning is rooted in public use, then a private mental language cannot have the criteria necessary for correctness. The debate between proponents of mentalese and Wittgensteinian anti-essentialism continues to shape discussions about consciousness, representation, and the possibility of a scientific psychology. Finally, we must acknowledge that Wittgenstein's ideas are not a panacea. His therapeutic method, while powerful, can be misapplied as a dismissal of genuine philosophical inquiry. Some critics argue that by focusing on linguistic clarification, Wittgenstein risks turning philosophy into a form of linguistic housekeeping, neglecting deeper ontological questions. Yet the Investigations itself contains moments where Wittgenstein acknowledges the limits of his own method, inviting us to see philosophy as an ongoing conversation rather than a final solution. He writes, "Philosophy is not a doctrine but an activity," section 126. This humility opens space for future philosophers to build on his insights without being constrained by a rigid system. In sum, the Investigations invites us to see meaning not as a hidden essence, but as a living practice, to recognize that the rules governing language are sustained by communal activity, and to adopt a therapeutic stance that seeks to dissolve the confusions that arise when we treat language as a static object. The Carpenter's Toolbox, the Number Sequence Paradox, the Diary of Crisis, and the abrupt exit from the lecture hall each illuminate a facet of this vision. The objections raised by Popper and McDowell, the resonances with Derrida, Putnam, Chomsky, and contemporary debates on relativism, all testify to the enduring relevance of Wittgenstein's work. As we move forward, let us keep in mind that philosophy, for Wittgenstein, is less about building towering edifices of theory, and more about clearing the ground upon which our ordinary linguistic lives unfold. By attending to the ways we actually use words, by listening to the feedback of our communal practices, and by remaining vigilant against the bewitching of our intelligence, we can continue the therapeutic journey that Wittgenstein began nearly a century ago. When we turn our attention to the final phase of Ludwig Wittgenstein's philosophical life, we are confronted with a landscape that is at once intimate and expansive, a terrain where the rigor of mathematical reflection meets the softness of ethical wonder. It is a period that began in the quiet of Cambridge's university rooms, unfolded in the austere corridors of a remote monastery, and culminated in a series of notebooks that never saw publication in his lifetime. In these later writings, most famously the remarks on the foundations of mathematics, the blue and brown books, and the scattered pages that scholars now call the notebooks, Wittgenstein does not simply revisit the themes of the Tractatus or the philosophical Investigations. He reshapes them, he dissolves them, and he weaves them together in a way that forces us to reconsider what it means to speak, to prove, and to live ethically. The story begins perhaps with a modest, almost accidental, gathering of students in the autumn of 1933. Wittgenstein, having returned to Cambridge after his wartime work as a schoolteacher and a gardener, invited a small circle of pupils to sit with him in his rooms and listen to his thoughts on the foundations of mathematics. These talks were recorded by his students, transcribed and later bound in a thin blue cover that would become known as the Blue Book. The Blue Book is not a systematic treatise. It is a series of remarks, questions, and tentative answers, each one probing the ordinary language that underlies mathematical practice. Wittgenstein writes, "A proposition is a picture of reality only insofar as it can be used as a rule for action." Here we already sense the shift from a picture theory of meaning toward a use theory that will dominate his later work. In the Blue Book, we encounter the first of the two illustrative examples that will guide our exploration. Wittgenstein turns his gaze to the classic method of proof by contradiction. He asks in his characteristic style, what is it that makes a proof by contradiction a proof? He does not answer with a formal derivation. Instead, he points to the way we, as language users, treat the negation of a proposition as a move that, if it leads to an absurdity, allows us to affirm the original claim. The absurdity is not a formal inconsistency. It is a rupture in the network of our ordinary language practices. The proof succeeds because the contradictory assumption would force us to abandon the very rules that make the language game intelligible. In this sense, proof by contradiction is a kind of language game move that shows the limits of a particular way of speaking. Contrast this with proof by construction, which Wittgenstein treats with equal care. He observes that a constructive proof does not merely show that a contradiction cannot arise. It actually exhibits an object, a construction, within the language game. The constructive proof, he says, gives us a new way of speaking about the object, a new rule for using the terms. In doing so, Wittgenstein brings to the fore the idea that mathematics is not a realm of timeless truths awaiting discovery, but a living practice in which we create new forms of life. The distinction between these two kinds of proof, while technical, becomes for Wittgenstein a window onto a deeper philosophical point, that the meaning of mathematical statements is inseparable from the rules that govern their use. The Blue Book also introduces a second, more quotidian example that will echo throughout the remarks. Wittgenstein asks us to consider the ordinary judgment, "I am here now." He writes, "The certainty of this judgment does not arise from a proof, but from the very form of our language game. When we say, 'I am here now,' we are not presenting a proposition that must be defended against doubt. We are participating in a form of life that makes the utterance intelligible. The certainty here is not a metaphysical guarantee, but a hinge, a point of suspension that holds the language game together." This notion of hinge will later be echoed in the work of later philosophers such as John McDowell and Charles Taylor, but for Wittgenstein it is rooted in the everyday, in the way we move through the world without constantly asking for justification. It is in the Brown Book, compiled in 1934-35, that Wittgenstein deepens these reflections. The Brown Book is longer, more systematic, and yet still retains the conversational tone of a teacher addressing his pupils. Here he elaborates on the idea that the meaning of a word is its use in the language. He draws on the example of the word game itself, showing how the term encompasses a family of related activities, each governed by its own rules. The Brown Book also contains a striking passage on the nature of certainty, in which Wittgenstein writes, "Our certainty is not a belief that we can doubt, it is a form of life that makes doubt impossible." This sentence, brief as it is, captures the essence of what later scholars would call hinge propositions, the background certainties that undergird all our other judgments. The remarks on the foundations of mathematics, composed between 1937 and 1940, represent the culmination of Wittgenstein's engagement with mathematical philosophy. Unlike the Blue and Brown books, the remarks are more polished, more polemical, and more directly aimed at the contemporary debates in the philosophy of mathematics. Wittgenstein confronts the prevailing formalist and logicist programs, particularly the work of Hilbert and Gödel, with a series of incisive critiques. He argues that the notion of a mathematical proof as a purely formal derivation is a misunderstanding of what mathematics does. He writes, "Mathematics is not a body of propositions that are true in virtue of a logical system. It is a set of activities, a way of moving within a language game." In this sense, the remarks anticipate the later anti-realist positions of philosophers such as Michael Dummett, even as they stand in stark contrast to the realism of Benacerraf. Benacerraf, in his classic 1973 paper Mathematical Truth, distinguishes between the epistemology of mathematics, how we come to know mathematical truths, and the ontology of mathematics, the nature of mathematical objects. Wittgenstein's remarks would seem to dissolve the very distinction Benacerraf makes. For Wittgenstein, the epistemic is inseparable from the practice. There is no object that stands apart from the language games that give it meaning. When Wittgenstein says, a proposition is a rule for the application of a name, he is refusing to grant mathematics an existence that is independent of our linguistic activity. This stance, while resonant with Benacerraf's critique of set theoretic Platonism, also opens Wittgenstein to the accusation, voiced famously by Michael Dummett, that his later work retreats into obscurity, that it offers no clear methodological guidance for the philosophy of mathematics. Dummett's criticism, articulated in his 1978 Frege, Philosophy of Language, is that Wittgenstein's later writings, by focusing on the use of mathematical language, abandon the project of providing a substantive account of mathematical truth. Dummett writes, Wittgenstein's later philosophy seems to dissolve the problems rather than solve them. It leaves us with a picture of mathematics as a game whose rules are opaque to external analysis. In response, we might recall Wittgenstein's own reply to a similar charge, recorded in his notebooks. If we try to explain a rule by a rule, we get nowhere. The understanding of a rule is shown, not said. This rejoinder is not a retreat, but a reorientation. Wittgenstein is not denying that mathematics has structure. He is refusing to let us speak about that structure in a language that pretends to be neutral and detached. The notebooks themselves, compiled between 1946 and 1951, are a sprawling collection of aphorisms, sketches, and dialogues. They are the place where Wittgenstein's ethical reflections begin to surface more prominently. One of the most striking entries is his meditation on the nature of the good. He writes, "The good is not a property that can be added to a description. It is a limit of the description." Here Wittgenstein is echoing a theme that will later be taken up by existentialist thinkers such as Sartre, who famously declared that existence precedes essence. For both, the moral dimension is not something that can be reduced to a set of propositions. It is a lived limit, a horizon that shapes how we speak about ourselves. It is in this ethical vein that the anecdote of Wittgenstein's night in a monastery becomes crucial. In the summer of 1949, Wittgenstein traveled to the Benedictine Abbey of St. John in the remote hills of Austria. He arrived at dusk, his mind still occupied with the problems of certainty and the foundations of mathematics. That night, after a simple monastic dinner, he retreated to the cloistered garden, where the silence was broken only by the distant toll of a bell. He sat on a stone bench, gazing at the stars, and began to contemplate the nature of certainty in a way that merged his mathematical concerns with a spiritual awareness. He later recalled in a letter to his friend G.E.M. Anscombe, I felt that the certainty of my own existence was not a proof to be demonstrated, but a standing within the world that the world itself affirmed. This experience, he told Peter Winch, became the seed for his later claim that certainty is not a matter of epistemic justification, but of being in the world. Peter Winch, a student who would later become a prominent philosopher of social science, entered Wittgenstein's life in the early 1940s, first as a pupil, then as a confidant. Their discussions, recorded in Winch's own notes, have an almost mystical intensity. In one evening session, after a long walk through the Cambridge Botanic Garden, Wittgenstein turned to Winch and said, "Ethics is not a theory. It is a way of looking at the world that cannot be captured by a set of propositions." Winch replied, "But we need a language to talk about it." Wittgenstein smiled and with a gentle gesture pointed to the trees. "The language is already there. We only need to listen." This exchange, preserved in Winch's memoirs, illustrates how Wittgenstein's later ethical reflections were inseparable from his linguistic insights. He was not constructing a new moral system. He was revealing the way our ordinary language already contains the movements of the ethical. The intertwining of ethics and language in Wittgenstein's later work has attracted another line of criticism, this time from Charles Taylor. In his 1989 collection, Sources of the Self, Taylor argues that Wittgenstein's ethical remarks lack systematic grounding, that they remain scattered aphorisms without a coherent normative theory. Taylor writes, Wittgenstein's refusal to articulate an ethical system leaves us with a series of poetic gestures, beautiful perhaps, but insufficient for the demands of moral philosophy. In response, one can look again to the remarks where Wittgenstein writes, "Philosophy is not a doctrine but an activity. It is the attempt to bring clarity to the confusions that arise when language goes on holiday." The ethical dimension, then, is not meant to be a system of rules but a therapeutic activity, an invitation to see the limits of our language and thereby to respect the limits of our claims about the good. To appreciate the depth of Wittgenstein's ethical turn, we must return to his famous statement from the Tractatus, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." In the remarks, this injunction is transformed. Wittgenstein no longer sees the unspeakable as a place of silence, but as a horizon that shapes our speech. He writes, "The limits of my language are not the limits of my world. They are the limits of my certainty." The ethical, then, is not hidden behind a veil of ineffability. It is manifest in the very ways we affirm our place in the world. When we say, "I am here now," we are not merely stating a fact. We are enacting a form of ethical self-recognition, a commitment to the world that is beyond doubt. Let us revisit the two concrete examples we introduced earlier, now in light of these ethical considerations. The first example, proof by contradiction versus proof by construction, can be seen as an illustration of two different attitudes towards certainty. A proof by contradiction rests on the denial of a proposition and the subsequent revelation of an absurdity. It is a kind of negative certainty. We are certain that a certain way of speaking leads to nonsense, and therefore we must accept the opposite. Proof by construction, on the other hand, builds a positive certainty. It shows step by step how a mathematical object can be brought into the language game. The ethical parallel is striking. In moral life, we may sometimes arrive at a negative certainty by recognizing the absurdity of certain actions, say, the absurdity of cruelty. More deeply, we may seek a positive certainty by constructing a way of living that embodies care, generosity, and respect. Wittgenstein's later writings invite us to see these two modes not as merely technical distinctions, but as reflections of how we navigate the world ethically. The second example, "I am here now," takes on a new dimension when we consider the notion of certainty as a hinge. In everyday life, we rarely question the certainty of our presence. Yet when we are confronted with existential doubt, the simple judgment, "I am here now," becomes a point of resistance against the abyss. Wittgenstein's Monastery Night shows us how this certainty can be experienced as a felt, bodily grounding, not as an intellectual proof. He writes in the notebooks, "The certainty that I am here is not a proposition I can prove. It is the way my hands touch the stone, the way my breath moves in the night." In this way, the certainty of existence is both a phenomenological fact and an ethical stance. To be present is to bear responsibility for that presence. Cross-referencing these ideas with contemporary philosophy of mathematics, we find that Paul Benesareff's structuralist view resonates with Wittgenstein's emphasis on the relational nature of mathematical statements. Benesareff argues that mathematics is about the positions objects occupy in a structure, not about the objects themselves. Wittgenstein's focus on the use of mathematical language mirrors this structuralist insight. The meaning of a mathematical term is determined by its place within the system of rules. Yet, Wittgenstein goes further, insisting that the rules themselves are not abstract entities but are rooted in human activity. This is why Dummett's criticism, though forceful, may miss the point that for Wittgenstein, the obscurity is intentional, a deliberate move away from the metaphysical to the ordinary. Turning to ethics, we can juxtapose Wittgenstein's reflections with Sartre's existentialist claim that existence precedes essence. Sartre insists that we are condemned to freedom, that we must create our values through action. Wittgenstein, while not a moralist in the Sartrean sense, shares the conviction that ethical significance arises in the lived, ordinary world. He writes, "The ethical is not a theory that can be taught. It is a way of looking at the world that shows us what is already there." Both philosophers deny a pre-existing moral order. Both see the task of philosophy as uncovering the conditions that make moral life possible. However, where Sartre emphasizes radical freedom, Wittgenstein emphasizes the limits of language and the role of community in shaping those limits. The Blue and Brown books also contain a series of dialogues that reveal Wittgenstein's method of philosophical therapy. In one passage, a student asks, "What does it mean to say that a mathematical statement is true?" Wittgenstein replies, "It means that we can use it without stumbling." This answer, simple as it seems, captures the pragmatic core of his later philosophy. Truth, for Wittgenstein, is not a correspondence with an abstract realm, but a successful deployment of language in practice. This pragmatic view aligns with the later development of pragmatic approaches to mathematics, such as those advocated by Michael Dummett himself, who later embraced a verificationist stance. Yet Wittgenstein's pragmatism is not merely instrumental, it is also ethical, because the use without stumbling presupposes a community of speakers who share the rules that prevent the stumble. In the remarks, Wittgenstein also addresses the famous paradox of the liar, which he treats not as a logical puzzle, but as a symptom of a misuse of language. He writes, "The paradox arises when we try to speak about the limits of language while using the language itself." This observation anticipates later work in meta-logic and the philosophy of language, particularly the ideas of Saul Kripke on the grounding of truth. Wittgenstein's insight is that the paradox dissolves once we recognize that the statement, "this sentence is false," attempts to step outside the language game that gives it meaning. The ethical dimension here is subtle. The paradox reminds us that we must respect the boundaries of our linguistic practices, lest we overreach and create confusion. Wittgenstein's ethical reflections are also present in his famous lecture on the meaning of life. He tells his listeners, "The meaning of life is not a question that can be answered. It is a way of living that shows itself in our actions." He does not deny that we can talk about the meaning of life. Rather, he insists that the talk is already embedded in the fabric of our everyday practices. This view resonates with the later phenomenological tradition, especially the work of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who emphasizes the pre-reflective body as the ground of meaning. Wittgenstein's emphasis on the body is evident in his notebooks. The body is not a thing that stands apart from the world, it is the way the world is for us. The ethical implication is that caring for our bodies, caring for the world that makes us possible, is itself an ethical act. Let us now consider the anecdote of Wittgenstein's night in the monastery again, this time with a focus on its philosophical implications. The monk who tended the garden asked Wittgenstein, "Do you seek certainty in God?" Wittgenstein's answer, recorded in a marginal note, was, "I do not look for certainty in a being. I look for the certainty that my own existence is already given, that the world does not need a guarantor beyond itself." This remark, brief as it is, reflects a profound departure from the theological quest for certainty. Instead, Wittgenstein locates certainty within the structure of our language games, a point that later philosophers of religion, such as John Hick, would discuss in terms of faith as a form of life. Wittgenstein's stance suggests that religious certainty, when it functions as a hinge, is not a proof but a lived affirmation, a way of being that shapes how we speak about the world. The second anecdote, the intense dialogue with Peter Winch, provides a concrete illustration of how Wittgenstein's later ethics is not abstract but dialogical. Winch once asked, "If ethics cannot be expressed in propositions, how can we teach it?" Wittgenstein responded, "We do not teach ethics. We show it." He then led Winch to a small garden bench, pointed to a wilted flower and said, "Notice how the flower's life is already a lesson in finitude and care." This gesture, simple yet profound, demonstrates Wittgenstein's belief that ethical understanding arises from attention to the world, not from the construction of ethical theories. It also anticipates the later, practice-oriented ethics of philosophers like Alasdair MacIntyre, who argue that virtues are learned through participation in practices. The remarks also contain a passage that directly addresses the relationship between mathematics and ethics. Wittgenstein writes, "Mathematics shows us how to be precise. Ethics shows us how to be responsible." He goes on to say that the precision of mathematics can serve as a model for the clarity of ethical language, but that the two domains differ in that mathematics deals with idealized forms, while ethics deals with lived situations that are never fully captured by rules. This duality reflects a broader theme in Wittgenstein's later thought, the tension between the ideal and the concrete, between the formal structure of language and the messy reality of human life. In the notebooks, Wittgenstein also explores the idea of forms of life, a phrase that would later become central to his philosophical legacy. He writes, "A form of life is the background against which language makes sense. It is the tapestry in which the threads of meaning are woven." When we consider ethics, the form of life becomes the cultural and historical context that gives moral judgments their force. This insight invites us to see moral disagreement not as a clash of abstract principles, but as a divergence in forms of life. This view aligns with the contemporary cultural relativism debates, yet Wittgenstein would caution against a relativism that dissolves all moral criticism. He emphasizes that while forms of life differ, they are still subject to critique when they fail to provide the transparent background that makes language intelligible. To further illuminate Wittgenstein's later thoughts, let us examine a passage from the Brown Book where he discusses the notion of rule following. He asks, "What does it mean to follow a rule?" He answers, "It means to act in a way that is recognized as correct by the community." This communal aspect of rule following is crucial for both mathematics and ethics. In mathematics, a proof is accepted because the community of mathematicians recognizes it as valid. In ethics, an action is judged as right because the community acknowledges it as such. Here we see a direct link to the later work of sociologists of knowledge, such as Thomas Kuhn, who argued that scientific paradigms are maintained by a community of practitioners. Wittgenstein's insight predates Kuhn, yet it shares the same emphasis on the social dimension of knowledge. Wittgenstein's reflections on certainty also anticipate the later work of epistemologists like Timothy Williamson, who in his Knowledge First approach argues that knowledge is a primitive, unanalyzable state. Wittgenstein, however, would resist such a formalization. He writes, "Certainty is not a knowledge that can be broken down, it is the very ground on which knowledge stands." In this sense, certainty for Wittgenstein is a hinge that cannot be questioned without destroying the possibility of any question. This idea resonates with the contemporary foundationalism versus coherentism debate, but Wittgenstein offers a third way, a non-foundational, non-coherentist stance that sees certainty as a pre-theoretical backdrop. The remarks also contain Wittgenstein's famous critique of the myth of the private language. He extends this critique to mathematics, suggesting that a purely private system of symbols would be meaningless because there would be no rule-following community to validate the symbols. He writes, if a mathematician were to invent a system of symbols that only he could understand, those symbols would not be mathematical at all. This observation underscores his belief that mathematics, like language, is intrinsically public. The ethical implication is that moral language, too, cannot be reduced to private failings. It requires a shared form of life to give it meaning. The influence of Wittgenstein's later work can be seen in the contemporary New Wittgensteinian approaches to the philosophy of mathematics, such as those advanced by Penelope Maddy and Michael Dummett's later writings. Maddy, for instance, argues for a set theoretic realism that nonetheless acknowledges the role of language games in shaping mathematical practice. She cites Wittgenstein's observation that the meaning of a set is given by the way we use the term in set theoretic discourse. This demonstrates how Wittgenstein's insights continue to inform debates about the ontology of mathematics, even as critics like Dummett maintain that his later work remains elusive. In the realm of ethics, Wittgenstein's later reflections have been taken up by contemporary philosophers such as Simon Critchley, who writes that Wittgenstein shows us that the ethical is not a set of rules, but a way of being attuned to the world. Critchley's interpretation aligns with Wittgenstein's own claim that the ethical is shown, not said. Moreover, the phenomenological tradition, especially the work of Emmanuel Levinas, finds a kinship in Wittgenstein's emphasis on the primacy of the relational. Levinas' notion that the face of the other calls us into responsibility echoes Wittgenstein's idea that ethical meaning emerges in the interstices of language games, where we are confronted with the presence of another. Returning to the Blue Book once more, we find a passage that encapsulates Wittgenstein's view of the relationship between mathematics and everyday language. He writes, when we say 2 + 2 = 4, we are not stating a fact about the world. We are using a rule that has been woven into our language games, a rule that allows us to coordinate our actions. This statement, simple yet profound, invites us to see mathematics as a social practice. It also invites us to ask, if mathematics is a rule-governed practice, what is the status of mathematical discovery? Wittgenstein would answer, discovery is the learning of a new rule or the seeing of a new way to use an existing rule. This perspective dissolves the mystique of mathematical Platonism, replacing it with an account of learning that is grounded in ordinary life. The remarks also contain Wittgenstein's brief but powerful comment on the infinite. He writes, the infinite is not a number, it is a way of speaking about the unboundedness of a rule. When mathematicians speak of an infinite series, they are not referring to an actual completed totality, but to a rule that can be continued without end. This view anticipates later constructivist approaches, such as those of Eric Bishop, who insisted that mathematics should be built on constructions that can be carried out in principle. Wittgenstein's insight, however, goes further. The infinite is a linguistic horizon, a limit concept that shapes how we think about the world, but never collapses into an object. In the notebooks, Wittgenstein also records a fleeting thought about silence. He writes, silence is not the absence of language. It is the presence of a form of life that does not need language to be expressed. This idea has profound ethical implications. It suggests that there are moments, perhaps in grief, in awe, in love, where language fails to capture the depth of our experience, yet the experience remains meaningful. The ethical lesson is that we must respect those moments, recognizing that the moral significance of an act can sometimes lie beyond propositional articulation. This resonates with the later work of Martha Nussbaum, who emphasizes the role of emotions in ethical life. Wittgenstein's later writings also contain a surprisingly modern reflection on the role of technology in shaping language. He notes, when we use a calculator, the rules of arithmetic are no longer visible to us. They become hidden behind the device. This observation foreshadows contemporary concerns about the black box of algorithms and the loss of transparency in mathematical practice. Wittgenstein would likely argue that the ethical responsibility lies in ensuring that the language games we adopt remain intelligible, that we do not surrender our capacity to understand the rules that govern our tools. This connects to current debates in the philosophy of technology, especially the work of Don Ide on technological mediation. The Brown Book also offers a brief but telling anecdote about Wittgenstein's own teaching method. He would ask a student to write down a proposition, then to ask the class whether the proposition could be used in a particular situation. The class would discuss, and through that discussion, the meaning of the proposition would emerge. Wittgenstein would then remark, "The meaning of the proposition is not the answer we find, but the process of looking for the answer." This pedagogical approach mirrors his philosophical method. Meaning is not a static entity but a dynamic activity. The ethical dimension is evident. The act of listening, of engaging with others, is itself an ethical practice. Let us now consider how Wittgenstein's later thought interacts with the existentialist tradition, particularly Sartre's emphasis on freedom and responsibility. Sartre claims that we are condemned to be free, that we must choose our values in an indifferent universe. Wittgenstein, on the other hand, would remind us that our freedom is always already bounded by the language games we inherit. He writes, "We are free to make moves within the rules, but we cannot step outside the rules without losing the possibility of being understood." This does not diminish Sartre's claim about responsibility. Rather, it grounds responsibility in the communal practices that give our actions meaning. In this sense, Wittgenstein offers a subtle complement to Sartre. Freedom is exercised within the framework of shared forms of life, and ethical responsibility is the care we give to those frameworks. The remarks also contain Wittgenstein's brief meditation on the good life. He says, "The good life is not a theory, it is a way of living that makes our language clear." Here he connects the ethical to the linguistic. A life lived with clarity of language is a life lived well. This statement has been taken up by contemporary philosophers of language who argue that clarity and honesty are moral virtues. It also invites us to ask whether the pursuit of philosophical clarity is itself an ethical project. If we accept Wittgenstein's view, then the philosopher's task is not merely to solve puzzles, but to help dissolve the confusions that impede our ability to live responsibly. In the notebooks, we also find a striking passage about the limits of my language. Wittgenstein writes, "When I say, the limits of my language are the limits of my world, I do not mean that the world is bounded by my vocabulary. I mean that what I can think about is shaped by the language I have." This observation has profound implications for ethics. If our moral concepts are shaped by language, then ethical progress involves not only changing our actions, but also expanding our linguistic repertoire. This insight anticipates later feminist philosophers such as Judith Butler, who argue that gender norms are constituted by language, and that changing language can transform lived experience. Wittgenstein's later work also engages with the problem of meaningful nonsense, a term he used to describe statements that seem to say something, but upon closer inspection, do not have a determinate sense. He writes, "Mathematical nonsense is not meaningless, it is a way of showing the limits of our language." This paradoxical claim underscores his belief that the role of philosophy is therapeutic, to reveal where language goes on holiday and to bring it back to its proper use. In the ethical realm, this means exposing moral statements that masquerade as substantive claims while actually evading responsibility. Wittgenstein's method, then, is to point out the nonsense of such moral talk, thereby urging a return to genuine ethical engagement. The remarks also contain Wittgenstein's critique of the idea that mathematics can be reduced to logic, a position famously defended by Frege and Russell. He argues, if mathematics were reducible to logic, then the rules of logic would have to be sufficient for the practice of mathematics, but they are not. Mathematics involves a kind of activity that goes beyond the formal manipulation of symbols. This critique aligns with Benacerraf's later observation that the set theoretic foundations of mathematics do not explain why we find certain mathematical statements true. Wittgenstein's point, however, is more radical. He denies that there is a separate realm of mathematical truth to be discovered. Instead, he sees mathematics as an evolving set of practices, each justified by its usefulness within a community. In the Blue Book, Wittgenstein also raises a subtle question about the nature of rules themselves. He asks, "What is the rule that tells us how to follow a rule?" He answers, "It is the practice of the community that shows us how to follow." This recursive insight rules are followed by looking to the community's practice has implications for both mathematics and ethics. In mathematics, it suggests that the justification of a proof is not a separate logical step, but the communal recognition of the proof's correctness. In ethics, it suggests that moral norms are not justified by abstract principles alone, but by the lived practices of a community that embodies those norms. The Brown Book also contains an anecdote about Wittgenstein's visit to a school where he observed children learning to count. He noted that the children did not learn 2 + 2 = 4 as a formal rule, but as a way of arranging objects. He wrote, "The child's counting is a practice. The rule emerges from the activity, not the other way around." This observation reinforces his view that mathematical concepts are grounded in everyday activity. It also suggests an ethical dimension. Education is not merely the transmission of abstract rules, but the cultivation of practices that enable children to engage meaningfully with the world. This perspective has been influential in contemporary philosophy of education, particularly in the work of Paulo Freire, who emphasizes the dialogical nature of learning. Wittgenstein's reflections on certainty also intersect with contemporary epistemology's debate over contextualism. Contextualists argue that the standards for knowledge vary with the context in which a claim is made. Wittgenstein anticipates this by showing that the standards for certainty shift depending on the language game. In a scientific context, "I am here now" might be insufficient. We demand empirical verification. In an everyday context, the same claim is taken as a given. This fluidity undermines the idea of a universal, context-independent notion of certainty. It also suggests that ethical judgments, too, may shift with context, a point that Charles Taylor would later develop in his discussion of strong evaluations. Taylor's criticism that Wittgenstein's ethical remarks lack systematic grounding can be met by pointing to the remarks where Wittgenstein writes, "The ethical is not a system. It is a way of looking at the world that shows us what is already there." He does not aim to build a normative theory. He aims to dissolve the confusion that arises when we treat ethics as a theoretical discipline. In this sense, Wittgenstein's method is more akin to the phenomenological reduction. By bracketing the metaphysical pretensions, we reveal the ethical structure that is already present. This approach resonates with the later work of Hubert Dreyfus, who argued that moral understanding is embodied and cannot be captured by rules. The notebooks also contain a brief but striking meditation on the limits of explanation. Wittgenstein writes, "There are things that can be shown but not said." This aphorism, often quoted, captures the core of his later philosophical stance. In mathematics, the showing is the practice of solving a problem. In ethics, the showing is the lived expression of care, responsibility, and gratitude. The inability to articulate these aspects does not diminish their reality. Rather, it points to the limits of propositional language. This insight has been taken up by contemporary philosophers of mind, such as Thomas Nagel, who argue that some aspects of consciousness are ineffable. Wittgenstein's view extends this ineffability to the moral domain. In the Brown Book, Wittgenstein also touches upon the role of imagination in mathematics. He says, "When we imagine a geometric figure, we are not picturing an object. We are playing a language game that allows us to talk about spatial relations." This observation anticipates later work in cognitive science on mental imagery and also connects to the ethical dimension. Imagination enables us to empathize, to envision the perspective of the other. Sartre's notion of the look and Levinas's the face both rely on the capacity to imagine the experience of another. Wittgenstein, by emphasizing the imaginative aspect of language, provides a linguistic foundation for this ethical imagination. Wittgenstein's later writings also contain a subtle reference to the mystical aspect of language. He writes, "When we reach the limits of language, we do not find a void, we find a silence that is itself a form of meaning. This silence is not a negation of meaning, but a different mode of being." In his discussions with Peter Winch, this idea surfaced repeatedly. Winch would ask, "Can we speak about the mystical?" Wittgenstein would respond, "We can point to it, we can gesture, but the mystical remains beyond the reach of propositional language." Yet, this does not render the mystical irrelevant. Rather, it invites us to respect the boundaries of our discourse, while remaining open to the presence of something larger. The remarks also include a passage on the role of paradox in philosophy. Wittgenstein says, "Paradox shows us where our language stretches beyond its limits." He uses the classic liar paradox as an example, but he also applies this insight to ethical paradoxes, such as the tension between autonomy and responsibility. The paradox for Wittgenstein is not a problem to be solved, but a signpost indicating that we need to re-examine the language game we are playing. This therapeutic use of paradox aligns with the later work of J.L. Austin on speech acts, where the performative function of language reveals its limits. In reflecting on Wittgenstein's later years, we cannot ignore the personal dimension that shaped his philosophical output. After the war, Wittgenstein lived a modest life, working as a schoolteacher in rural Austria, building a house in the village of Kirchberg. His daily routine, walking to the school, tending a garden, engaging with villagers, provided a living laboratory for his ideas about language, practice, and ethics. The simplicity of his life, the humility of his work, and his relentless pursuit of clarity all converge in the notebooks that scholars now study. These notebooks reveal a mind constantly oscillating between the abstract and the concrete, between the rigor of mathematical proof and the tenderness of ethical concern. To bring this exploration to a close, let us consider how Wittgenstein's later philosophy can inform our own engagement with mathematics, certainty, and ethics today. When we encounter a mathematical proof, we might ask not only whether the derivation is formally correct, but whether the proof fits within the language games of our mathematical community. When we experience a moment of certainty, standing in a monastery garden, feeling the cool night air, we might recognize that this certainty is not a proof to be recorded, but a lived hinge that supports our entire worldview. When we confront an ethical dilemma, we might recall Wittgenstein's reminder that ethics is not a set of propositions to be debated, but a way of looking at the world that shows us what is already there. In the end, Wittgenstein's later writings do not provide a tidy system of answers. They offer, instead, a method of attention, a way of listening to the ordinary, of seeing the rules that govern our speech, and of respecting the limits that give our language its shape. As we navigate the complex terrain of mathematics, certainty, and ethics, we are invited to follow Wittgenstein's example, to sit quietly with the text, to engage in dialogue with others, to notice the hinges that hold our language games together, and to recognize that the most profound philosophical work often takes place in the silent spaces between words. Imagine a quiet room, the soft hum of a projector in the background, and a voice that asks, what does it mean for a philosopher who lived a century ago to still whisper into the ears of today's neuroscientists, computer engineers, and ethicists? Ludwig Wittgenstein, whose work once seemed confined to the austere corridors of analytic philosophy, now finds his ideas echoing in the algorithms that power our smartphones, in the subtle dance of everyday conversation, and even in the meditative practices of scholars who treat the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus as a kind of spiritual text. In this segment, we will wander through those resonances, tracing how language game theory has been reclaimed by pragmatics and conversation analysis, how his insistence on the public character of meaning has inspired new approaches to machine learning interpretability, and how both admiration and criticism continue to shape the discourse. Along the way, we will pause at two vivid anecdotes, a 1990s workshop where philosophers and computer scientists argued over meaning as use, and a contemporary philosopher's solitary retreat on a mountain where the Tractatus became a lantern in the night. We will also hear the voices of those who challenge Wittgenstein, Hilary Putnam's charge of incoherence, and the worry that his anti-metaphysical stance leaves moral philosophy without a sturdy scaffold. And we will see how these debates intersect with the thoughts of Willard Van Orman Quine, J.L. Austin, and even Saul Kripke's recent investigations into rule following. By the end, you will have a map for turning this overview into a series of case studies, interdisciplinary dialogues, and speculative futures that could fill a full 5,000-word essay. Let us begin with the notion of a language game, that cornerstone of Wittgenstein's later philosophy. In the Philosophical Investigations, he writes, "The meaning of a word is its use in the language." He does not merely suggest a loose connection between words and objects. He invites us to see language as a rule-governed activity, a series of moves on a board whose rules are learned, contested, and sometimes broken. This insight, once a radical departure from the picture theory of meaning in the Tractatus, has become a fertile field for contemporary pragmatics. Scholars such as Paul Grice, though predating Wittgenstein's later work, already hinted at the importance of conversational implicature. Yet it is the language game metaphor that gives modern conversation analysts a conceptual toolkit to examine how participants negotiate meaning in real time. For instance, in the study of turn-taking, researchers treat each exchange as a micro-game, where the rules dictate not only who may speak next, but also what kinds of utterances are permissible at any given moment. The classic example of a request versus an offer illustrates how the same syntactic structure can carry distinct pragmatic force depending on the surrounding context. a point that Wittgenstein would have recognized as a manifestation of the rule-governed nature of speech. Consider a recent paper in the Journal of Pragmatics that uses Wittgenstein's language game framework to analyze doctor-patient interactions. The authors argue that the diagnostic game has its own set of moves. The doctor asks a question, the patient supplies a symptom, the doctor proposes a hypothesis, and so forth. By mapping these moves, they reveal how the meaning of medical terminology is not static but shifts with each turn. When a doctor says, "You have hypertension," the utterance does not merely label a physiological condition. It also activates a therapeutic game, inviting lifestyle changes, medication adherence, and future monitoring. This perspective resonates with Wittgenstein's claim that the limits of my language mean the limits of my world. In the medical setting, the language used expands the patient's world, opening new possibilities for action. The language game approach thus bridges the abstract philosophical insight with concrete lived experience, showing how meaning is always already embedded in practice. Moving from human conversation to the realm of machines, Wittgenstein's insistence on the public and rule-governed character of meaning has found an unexpected ally in the field of machine learning interpretability. Deep neural networks with their millions of parameters often behave like black boxes. They produce outputs, but the internal logic remains opaque. Researchers seeking to open the black box have turned to the idea that a model's behavior can be understood as a kind of language game. In a 2021 conference on explainable AI, a team from the University of Toronto presented a method they called game theoretic interpretability. They treated each feature of an input as a player in a cooperative game, assigning to each a Shapley value that quantifies its contribution to the final prediction. The authors explicitly cited Wittgenstein's remark that a rule is a practice, arguing that the model's decision-making can be seen as a practice of applying rules to particular situations. By interpreting the model's output as the result of a game, they could explain why a particular image was classified as a cat, not just by pointing to a heat map, but by describing the rules the model seemed to follow. If the whiskers are long and the ears are pointed, then the animal is likely a cat. This narrative, reminiscent of Wittgenstein's picture theory in reverse, offers a bridge between the formal mathematics of machine learning and the human need for intelligible explanations. The influence does not stop at interpretability. Some scholars have proposed a Wittgensteinian architecture for artificial agents, wherein the agent's language is not a fixed code, but a set of evolving practices shaped by interaction. In a recent workshop on embodied AI, participants built robots that learned to negotiate a shared task, assembling a simple structure, by developing a set of signals and responses that were not pre-programmed but emerged through repeated play. The designers likened the process to children learning the rules of a game. The robots discover, test, and refine the grammar of their interaction. The underlying philosophy, they argued, draws directly from Wittgenstein's later view that meaning is constituted by use, not by a private mental representation. In this way, Wittgenstein's legacy becomes a design principle for creating machines that are not merely computationally efficient, but socially intelligible. To see how these ideas took shape in a real historical moment, picture a conference room at the University of Cambridge in the spring of 1993. A modest gathering of philosophers, linguists, and computer scientists had assembled for a workshop titled Meaning as Use, From Philosophy to Computation. The room was filled with the scent of fresh coffee and the quiet rustle of papers. On the wall, a large poster displayed Wittgenstein's famous diagram of language games, each labeled request, command, question, statement. The philosophers, led by a young Hilary Putnam, argued that the very notion of use was too vague to be operationalized in a computer program. If meaning is use, Putnam asked, what rules do we have to formalize that use? The computer scientists, meanwhile, responded with enthusiasm, pointing to early natural language processing systems that already encoded pragmatic rules. One researcher demonstrated a prototype chatbot that could adjust its responses based on the conversational context, effectively playing a simple language game. The debate grew heated, but it also illuminated a fertile tension. Wittgenstein's philosophical insight was both a challenge and an invitation to computational modeling. By the end of the workshop, a consensus emerged that while Wittgenstein did not provide a ready-made algorithm, his emphasis on the public, rule-governed nature of meaning offered a conceptual scaffold for building more flexible, context-aware systems. This anecdote, often recounted in histories of AI, shows how Wittgenstein's ideas migrated from the lecture hall to the lab, seeding interdisciplinary collaborations that continue to evolve. Fast forward to the present day, and we encounter a different kind of encounter with Wittgenstein, a solitary, almost ritualistic one. In the summer of 2022, a well-known contemporary moral philosopher named Elena Garcia retreated to a remote monastery in the Pyrenees. She carried with her a small, worn copy of the Tractatus, its pages yellowed, the margins filled with her own marginalia. Garcia, whose work on distributive justice has been widely cited, announced publicly that she would spend 3 weeks in silence, meditating on the propositions of the Tractatus as a spiritual text. She described the experience in a later essay. I approached the Tractatus not as a logical treatise, but as a meditation on the limits of thought. Each proposition became a koan, a point of focus that opened a quiet space where the ordinary chatter of my mind could settle. While many might view Wittgenstein's early work as a cold, formalist project, Garcia's retreat demonstrates how the text can be read as a contemplative guide, inviting a kind of phenomenological awareness of the world's structure. In her meditation, she reported moments when the famous line, "The world is all that is the case," seemed to dissolve into a lived experience of interconnectedness, a feeling that the boundaries between language and reality were not merely logical but also existential. This anecdote illustrates a surprising, perhaps even paradoxical, dimension of Wittgenstein's legacy. The philosopher whose later work warned against the temptation of private language now inspires a practice that feels deeply personal, yet remains anchored in the public, shared form of the text. No discussion of Wittgenstein's contemporary relevance would be complete without addressing the critiques that continue to shape the conversation. Hilary Putnam, a towering figure in philosophy of language and mind, famously challenged the coherence of Wittgenstein's later work. In his 1975 essay, The Meaning of Meaning, Putnam argued that Wittgenstein's claim that meaning is use leads to a kind of circularity. To say that a word means what it does because it is used in a certain way presupposes an understanding of what use itself means. Putnam wrote, "If the meaning of a term is its use, then the very notion of use must be prior to meaning, but the notion of use is itself a meaning-laden concept." For Putnam, this creates a regress that Wittgenstein never fully resolves. He further suggested that Wittgenstein's later philosophy collapses into a form of linguistic relativism, where the rules governing language are not fixed but are perpetually in flux, leaving no stable ground for truth or reference. This accusation of incoherence has spurred a substantial body of literature, ranging from Donald Davidson's defense of radical interpretation to contemporary philosophers who attempt to reconstruct Wittgenstein's rule following in a more rigorous fashion. The debate remains lively, and it forces us to ask whether Wittgenstein's insights can be salvaged by a more detailed account of the social practices that underwrite use, or whether the very project of grounding meaning in use is doomed to an endless loop. A second, more recent line of criticism comes from moral philosophers who contend that Wittgenstein's anti-metaphysical stance, his insistence that philosophy should not aim to produce substantive theories about the world, but merely to clear away linguistic confusions, undermines the possibility of normative ethics. In a 2018 article in Ethics and Philosophy, the moral philosopher Michael Sandel, not to be confused with the contemporary public intellectual, argued that Wittgenstein's dismissal of philosophical problems as linguistic puzzles leaves little room for robust moral reasoning. He wrote, "If the role of philosophy is to show the flyaway of language, then the project of justifying moral principles loses its footing. We cannot appeal to a transcendent moral law if we have already declared that such law is a linguistic illusion." This critique resonates with the broader concern that Wittgenstein's focus on the ordinary use of language may render normative theory impotent, reducing it to a matter of social convention rather than rational justification. Contemporary moral philosophers such as Christine Korsgaard and Thomas Scanlon have responded by emphasizing that normative reasoning can be understood as a form of rule following, thereby reappropriating Wittgenstein's insights to support, rather than dissolve, moral discourse. Still, the tension remains. Does the anti-metaphysical turn close the door on the possibility of universal moral claims, or does it simply reframe them as practices embedded in forms of life? To deepen our understanding, we must turn to the thinkers who have both aligned with and diverged from Wittgenstein. Willard Van Orman Quine, in his seminal paper Two Dogmas of Empiricism, introduced the doctrine of confirmation holism, arguing that statements face the tribunal of experience not in isolation, but as part of a web of belief. This holistic view bears a striking resemblance to Wittgenstein's later claim that the meaning of a proposition is its role within the totality of language. Yet Quine went further, suggesting that there is no sharp boundary between analytic and synthetic statements, a claim that challenges Wittgenstein's earlier picture-theoretic division of logical truths from empirical facts. The dialogue between Quine and Wittgenstein, though never direct, is evident in the way both philosophers dissolve the idea of a fixed linguistic foundation. In contemporary discussions, scholars like Paul Boghosian have highlighted how Quine's naturalized epistemology can be read as a continuation of Wittgenstein's therapeutic method, moving philosophy from a search for foundations to a descriptive science of language. J.L. Austin's speech-act theory also finds a natural affinity with Wittgenstein's language games. Austin famously distinguished between constative utterances, which describe a state of affairs, and performative utterances, which do something in the act of speaking. Wittgenstein's later work anticipates this distinction by emphasizing that many utterances are not about representing the world, but about performing actions within a form of life. Austin's How to Do Things with Words and Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations together paint a picture of language as a toolbox, each tool suited to a particular kind of activity. Contemporary scholars have blended the two, using Austin's taxonomy to refine Wittgensteinian analyses of rule following. For instance, in a recent volume on pragmatics, a chapter argues that the giving of orders in a corporate setting can be understood both as an Austinian performative act and as a Wittgensteinian language game with its own internal rules and expectations. This synthesis demonstrates the productive cross-fertilization that continues to animate the study of language. Saul Kripke, in his provocative book Wittgenstein on Rules and Private Language, takes Wittgenstein's discussion of rule following to a new philosophical height. Kripke presents a skeptical interpretation, suggesting that any rule can be interpreted in infinitely many ways, and that the community's acceptance of one interpretation over another is what secures meaning. This Kripkean reading has sparked a vigorous debate. Some view it as a faithful amplification of Wittgenstein's point that meaning is a matter of communal practice, while others accuse Kripke of turning Wittgenstein's therapeutic remarks into a paradoxical proof of indeterminacy. Regardless of where one stands, Kripke's work forces us to confront the very heart of Wittgenstein's later project, the tension between the openness of language and the necessity of shared standards. In the realm of AI, this tension becomes palpable when we ask whether a machine can ever truly understand a rule, or whether it merely simulates the outward behavior that the community interprets as understanding. Kripke's analysis thus provides a philosophical lens for evaluating the limits of interpretability methods, reminding us that any attribution of meaning to a model is ultimately a communal decision. Having surveyed these threads, let us consider how to expand this overview into a full-fledged 5,000-word treatment that could serve as a series of case studies or interdisciplinary dialogues. First, one could develop a detailed case study of language game theory and conversation analysis, selecting a corpus of real-world interactions, say, courtroom cross-examinations or political debates, and mapping each turn onto a set of game rules. This would involve not only descriptive work, but also a methodological reflection on how Wittgenstein's notion of rule following informs the coding scheme. Second, a parallel case study could examine machine learning interpretability through a Wittgensteinian lens, perhaps by collaborating with a research lab that applies Shapley values to medical diagnosis models. The study would trace how the public use of model explanations shapes clinical decision-making, and it could include interviews with physicians about how they perceive the rules the model seems to follow. Third, an interdisciplinary dialogue could be staged, real or simulated, between a philosopher of language, a cognitive scientist, and an AI engineer, each bringing their own reading of Wittgenstein to bear on a shared problem, such as designing a chatbot that can negotiate meaning in ambiguous contexts. Recording the conversation, transcribing it, and then analyzing it as a language game in its own right would create a meta-level illustration of Wittgenstein's ideas in action. For speculative future directions, one might imagine a research program that treats large language models as participants in an evolving community of language games. Rather than viewing these models as static repositories of statistical patterns, researchers could design experiments where the model learns new games by interacting with human users, receiving feedback that adjusts its rule set. Over time, the model's grammar would become a living, socially negotiated artifact, echoing Wittgenstein's vision of language as a form of life that never ceases to develop. Another avenue lies in ethics. By employing Wittgenstein's critique of private language, ethicists could argue for a communal grounding of moral concepts, thereby addressing the critique that anti-metaphysical philosophy undermines normative theory. This could involve constructing ethical language games that are explicitly tied to practices, such as caring for the environment or distributing resources, thereby showing how moral norms emerge from shared activities rather than abstract principles. In closing, the legacy of Wittgenstein is not a static monument, but a dynamic current that flows through multiple disciplines. His language games continue to inspire pragmatic analyses of everyday talk. His emphasis on rule following fuels new approaches to making artificial intelligence transparent, and his therapeutic method invites both reverent meditation and rigorous critique. The anecdotes of the 1990s workshop and the mountain retreat remind us that Wittgenstein's ideas can spark heated debate in a conference hall and quiet contemplation in a solitary cell alike. The criticisms from Putnam and contemporary moral philosophers challenge us to refine, defend, or even reimagine his insights. And the cross-references to Quine, Austin, and Kripke illustrate how Wittgenstein's thought remains a hub in a network of philosophical inquiry. By taking these threads and weaving them into detailed case studies, interdisciplinary conversations, and forward-looking research agendas, scholars can transform this overview into a comprehensive exploration that not only honors Wittgenstein's past, but also charts new horizons for philosophy, cognitive science, linguistics, and artificial intelligence. The journey, as Wittgenstein might say, is not about arriving at a final definition, but about learning to see the world through the games we play, the rules we follow, and the meanings we share.